Hey guys, this is Jonathan and welcome to a C++ tutorial. In this tutorial we are going to be learning about the various types of variables. If you recall before, we dealt with the integer type of variable. So we would declare an integer such as int a. And let's say we set it to 5 right off the start. Then if we set int a equals 7, a would change. However, we need to remember that whenever we talk about a from now on, now that we know that it is an integer, we no longer use this word int. We already know what type it is. So we just refer to it as a equals 7 in programming. Now what we can do is say cout a. Now what happens here is a is set to 5, so in the memory of your computer, it sets aside some memory and it writes down 5 for the variable a. And then what happens is it comes to the second line and it erases the number 5 in the location dedicated to the variable a, and it changes it to 7. And then when we get the output, hopefully it should output 7. And we can see here that it gets 7. So 5 has been written over and it no longer exists for the variable a. However, there are more types of variables than int. Now we know that integer represents a number. I can't set int to be hello. That would be a problem. I can't even put quotes around hello to make it look like text. That is just unacceptable. It has to be a number. So there are different types of variables which will allow us to have different types of data. So what I've done is I've created this little chart so that we can tell what the basic types are, and feel free to download this from the description below. So let me just go through first on this middle little grid here. There are main types of variables. We have mostly dealt with the integer type, and we call it int when programming. There's also a character which can represent a single letter or symbol. So it could be an A or a B or a and symbol or an exclamation mark. But it can't be the word hello. That would be many characters put together. And that is not allowed in a single character variable. Then there's Boolean. Now a Boolean is written B-O-O-L in programming, and it is either a true or a false. It can only be one of two things. Then there's a floating point and double floating point, and there's a little bit of a distinction between the two, but basically these are numbers that allow decimal places. So an integer can only be a whole number, maybe positive, maybe negative, maybe 0, but it can't be 0.5 at the end. Whereas floats and double floating points can be have decimal places. But we have to remember one thing to note is that they aren't perfectly accurate. For instance, there will be a rounding problem. It will only go to 7 or 15 decimal places, and then it will cut it off. So you lose a little bit of precision with these. Then we have valueless variables. And you might think, well, what good is a variable if it can't store a value? But it does serve a purpose, and we will discuss that later on. But it is basically a variable that is nothing. It's like a box that is empty, sort of thing. And then there is a wide character, which is like character, but it is wider. It can handle fancier stuff and so on. Alright, now what we can do is we can take these things and we could say int and give it a name and set a value, or char and give it a name and set a value, but we can also add these modifiers. So instead of writing just int, we could write unsigned int. Now, let me just write this over here. Now, what an unsigned int does is it's saying the word unsigned means no negatives allowed. So any number from 0 to whatever the maximum number the int value variable can be. If it is signed, so if I just delete those two letters there, if it's signed, that means it can also include negative numbers. Now, a regular int is always a signed int. Signed is always the default. So just keep that in mind. And then there is short and long. And what these do is they either make the int a little bit shorter or a little bit longer. Now, an integer is stored in the computer. And so when I say it's shorter or longer, I'm referring to the fact that however much space the integer takes to store in the computer, that amount of space, if it's a long, will be larger, and therefore it can handle bigger numbers. Or if it's short, it will be smaller, more space efficient, but it can only handle smaller numbers. So that's basically what we can do, and we can have all sorts of combinations. Obviously, you can't have a signed, unsigned integer, but most combinations do work fairly well. And then here on the left, we have a big table, and this explains all the types, and it gives examples of combinations. Now, it doesn't have all combinations. For instance, I'm often using long longs, which aren't explained here, but this is most of them. And it shows you how many bytes of space. So a byte is 8 bits, 8 ones and zeros in the computer that it takes to store such a value. So if you're really worried about memory space, or you're using a ton of variables, which makes you worried, then you want to pick the smallest one that works for you. And int tends to work the fastest. It tends to be the most efficient value to retrieve and rewrite to for speed issues. And on the right third column here, we can see how big and how small the numbers can get to be. So you can see a char value, a character can only handle small amounts of items. So, and you notice that there aren't very many different symbols. There's an A and a Q and an exclamation mark, but those can all fit into here for the most part. Then we have an integer, and this can handle some pretty amazing numbers. But if we need to get even longer, we can go into an unsigned long int, or we could call it an unsigned long long, and that would allow us to make these even bigger numbers. So that actually a long long would be even larger than that, I believe. So that's basically how all of these different types of variables work, and we want to pick the appropriate variable. So if we're dealing with characters, if we're wanting to store the letter H, we want to use a char variable, not an integer. And if we're wanting to store the value of 56, we want to use the int type, and so on. And if we need really, really large numbers, we might end up using a long long or unsigned if we never need negatives. So use this. Feel free to download it from the description below and use it as a reference guide. You don't need to know all of these or their combinations. We'll slowly work these in tutorials, but this should help us lay a foundation for what is to come. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe.